Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're doing a video on the M16A2 conversion kits that were done, I probably would say the late 80s and into the 90s with the adoption of the M16A2. These are very common because right now for sale on several different places you'll be able to see these conversion M16A2 kits available today. And we also see pictures of rifles that sort of look sort of strange. They don't look like a typical M16A2. So I've been asked by several of my viewers to go over some of these conversion kits and how this was done. So that's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the conversion process. Now, around 85 or so, when the U.S. Army adopted the M16A2, there was a critical component of why that rifle came about, and that was the NATO standardization of the M855 or SS-109 62-grain projectile, requiring a 1 7-inch twist to stabilize. So for the U.S. Army or the U.S. government to standardize in a cartridge, they can no longer use the M16 and M16A1s with the 1 12-inch twist barrels. So that made it critical to convert the entire fleet over to the new 1 7-inch twist barrels. So we only had to worry about having one kind of ammunition. So what was looked at was the existing rifles, the original model 601, 602s of the Air Force, which were the original M16 or AR-15 rifles, the XM16E1s, the M16A1s. When you looked at those for a conversion kit, the lower receiver was perfectly suitable for use as a host for an M16A2. What the difference was the reinforced areas on the front and rear of the lower receiver. And of course, you had some various marking changes. Of course, with the burst rifle on the A2, you had safe semi-burst stamped on the right side of the rifle with a notch on the selector, so somebody who is left-handed would be able to see what condition the rifle was in. So you had that. So really, only other than the reinforcements in the front and rear, that was the only difference. There was, of course, one other exception, and that was the original model 601, 602s, which had a removable front pivot pin. Now, that was inconvenient just due to the fact you didn't have the boss on there, the magazine release boss, for preventing unintentional magazine release. You see you have some of those benefits, but quite frankly, a lot of those rifles were not really designed for use overseas. They were used more for training and more for continental United States use. However, they did find their ways over to those zones. So looking at those lower receivers were perfectly suitable. So what would you need to replace to make this into an M16A2? Well, the kit contained a complete upper receiver minus the bolt carrier and charging handle. So you had the 1 7-inch twist barrel, you had the A2 sights, the A2 upper receiver. What you would do is you would take the existing bolt carrier group and charging handle and install it into the upper receiver. The lower receiver, on the other hand, what you would be doing is, first off, you would be removing the stock assembly. You would be making some modifications to the lower receiver for as far as markings, which we're going to talk about, replacing the fire control group and the pistol grip. So let's go over that a little bit. Now, again, this was a necessity for standardization with the ammunition. The conversion kits were mostly manufactured by two companies. One was Capco, which is the most common, and the other one was MCO, both of which were spare parts manufacturers. They manufactured off the TDP. Now, for as far as their quality is concerned, that's a whole different ballgame. These are not OEM, FN, or Colt parts. However, Colt and FN did have some of those kinds of conversion kits, but the vast majority of them were by Capco. They would come in a single box, which would contain the barrel, the stock assembly, the fire control group, and the pistol grip. And then the armor would go ahead and do that. Now, how were these done? At first, you would have depot level, where you'd, like at a Army depot, you would have these rifles will come out there and you would have a massive conversion process by armorers there. However, they were also done at the unit level. I can remember my time when I was in Wisconsin. I worked with the Air Force wing out at the General Mitchell International Airport. And those rifles they had there were mostly all original M16s. They were A1 type lower receivers. They had the boss on them, but the upper receivers were no forward assist, and they had the triangular handguards, the 1 12-inch twist barrel. The armorer there, I remember Tony, because I helped him, and we did some of those together. Basically, he would pull out all these original M16 rifles. He would replace all the components. And that was sort of sad, was we had all these original upper receivers, lower receivers. I worked for the Crown Lab at the time, and we were tasked with destroying all those spare parts, and we had to have the Air Force there to watch the destruction of those going into a shredder, which was sort of sad. But this particular Air Force base, he did it all himself. The armor did it all himself, all those conversions. So they were done in a couple different ways. Again, unit level up to depot level. So let's talk about the lower receivers. We would start off with a lower receiver, a complete rifle. The lower receiver, for example, we'll start with. The lower receiver, the stock would be removed, which would be the A1 style stock. An A2 stock with a spacer would be slid on, and then you would have the new butt cap screw, which is longer for use with the A2 stock. Now we would look at the lower receiver. It came with a set of punches. The punches that came were marked safe, semi, burst, 4 X's, and then there was one marked A2. These were all to modify the lower receivers into the A2 configuration. Basically, you had a guide or a tool that was used to align these so you'd be able to get them in the proper location. So what would happen would be, first off, you would have safe, semi, burst. You would go to the right side of the rifle, you would have the punch, and you would do safe, semi, and auto. And you would punch that into the lower receiver. And those would line up with the notch on the selector, so it would mirror that of the M16A2, but you'd be able to modify the original lower receivers to have those witness marks. You go over to the left-hand side. Now you had auto on there, so you would have the punch that had the 4 X's, that would go over auto, hit that, and they would put all the X's through the auto. And now below there, you would have the punch that was marked burst, that would be underneath there. So now it would say safe, semi, burst, got rid of the auto, other side, safe, semi, burst, witness notch. Now you would have either a paint or some kind of an anodizing that you would put over those marks, because again, once you would punch those, you would see the silver. It would go through the finish, so that would prevent them from corroding. And then you would have the other part that was A2. What that would be is you would have, for instance, it would say M16A1. So you would take the A2, put that over the A1, give it a hit, then it would say M16A2. A little sloppy, but it would say A2. Or in the case where you would have your original model 01s that didn't say M16, they would just say Colt AR-15. Right below the AR-15, you would hit 2. We have some photographs that are showing you what we're talking about. So those were the markings that you would have that would be changed. Now you would always have that not my job or that guy who just doesn't care. We have a picture. This is actually a real rifle, where instead of somebody doing the proper stamping, they took a scribe and did safe, semi, burst. Somebody you would think would get court-martialed or go to jail or fired for that. That was unbelievable. But people were so lazy that when they did the conversions, they actually would use a scribe. But again, that picture is a real rifle that we saw. So after that was done, you would take you would remove the full auto fire control group, the pistol grip. You replace the burst fire control group in that. Then you would go ahead and take the A2 pistol grip and put that on there. So now your lower receiver is done. Now there was a couple other variations too, because again, with the Model 601s, you didn't have the captive front pivot pin. It actually was removable. Now all the upper receivers are compatible with the original Model 01 with having a notch cut in there where you have the removable front pivot pin. There was a little ball bearing on there that would catch onto that, so it would prevent it from walking in and out. Again, that was not ideal due to the fact that those could be lost, which is why they did the captive system to begin with. You did have that, and again, you did not have the safety net of having the boss around the magazine release to guard against the magazine being released if the gun was dropped on its side or if it was hit on its side at all. You did have that. You also had the XM16E1s where you did have the fence on there. It was a partial fence, and it was captive. So those worked out well. For as far as the quality of the receivers, it's the same 75. It's the same 7075 T6 aluminum receivers. They've always used the same forgings. The only difference was, again, the reinforcements on the A2 lower versus the magazine release boss on the Model 601s. So that would be your lower receiver. Now the upper receiver. Again, as I stated before, the upper receiver came solely as a receiver with no bolt or bolt carrier group or charging handle. You would take the existing charging handle and the existing bolt carrier out there. Again, in over 60 years, these parts are still compatible. You could take a bolt carrier group from a rifle made in 1963, put it in a modern M16A2 or M4, and it would work. But now is when it gets a little complicated. When you go back to those original Model 601s and XM16 rifles where you go with the chrome-plated bolt carrier groups, those were some of the parts that were changed out due to the use of ball powder and the increase in selective rate. And because of the increase in selective rate, it would cause those parts to wear much quicker. So part of the changes that were made to those initial bolt carriers where they got rid of the crowing and they had forward assist notches on all of them. The original 601, 602s did not have those forward assist notches, which meant when you would drop that carrier into the to the M16A2 upgrades or the conversion kits, the forward assist was not usable. You would have a carrier with no forward assist notches, which sort of would suck. But again, that was not a game stopper. The game stopper was really the bolt. The bolt was a part that was changed during that time period because of the higher cyclic rate. The bolts were wearing prematurely and they were breaking prematurely because they were meant to go around 600 and 700 rounds a minute, not 800 to 1,000. So the bolts were one of the major changes they did was they strengthened the material. They also shot peened the bolt, which made them better as well. There were several modifications that were made, and those were to use with the ball propellant, which is what we use today as ball propellant. So you would take those bolts and you would install them in the new rifles. They were generally not compatible. You also had to watch out for the firing pins too, because some of these older rifles still had the heavier firing pins that were replaced as well because of the issues with the slam fires and the primer sensitivity. They decreased the weight of those. Those are something that was supposed to be also changed out, as soon as they were found because they weren't generally considered safe. So in that worst case scenario, you would have a model 601 or 602 bolt carrier, chrome plated, no forward assist notches, and an old bolt. So those were some of the complications that would go along with that. However, would those guns work for training purposes? Yes. Deployment, not such a good idea. Now, for as far as these rifles being used overseas, if you go back to the Gulf War I era, that was 85 was when the A2s came into production, and then you figure Gulf War was 1990. So you had a 5-year time period where those rifles were just starting to be distributed. So you still had a massive fleet of M16A1 rifles and M16 rifles, especially in use with people like places like the Air Force. They were sort of the last ones to get the new A2s. So at that point, you would start seeing some of the conversion kits going over, and you would see, at that time, you saw both A1s and A2s in use. Your regular line units, you would see M16A2s, and your rear echelon, your Air Force, your people who were not generally engaging the enemy would normally have, these converted over rifles. And that's not saying they didn't see combat. They certainly did. But that was just normally how those rifles were used. So now we'll go forward to the global war on terror. Now, by the time 2000 kicked off, the A2 program was pretty much done. The conversions were over with. They had M16A2s in process. The M4s were just coming online. They were not a replacement for the M16A2 at that time at all. They were supposed to be for rear echelon troops who needed more firepower than a pistol but didn't want to carry a rifle. The M4 at that point, early on Global War on Terror, was not the weapon of choice, not yet. It wasn't really until the troops started using the two rifles and they decided which one they liked better that we started seeing the changeover go from the A2 to the M4 to the M16A4. So at that time, I don't recall ever seeing in the Middle East during that time period, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq, I never saw any A1s. That was pretty much done at that point. There's probably some of you guys out there who were over there. I was over there only brief periods of time for very short stints, but obviously I was working in small arms, so I was very much looking to see what was out there. There's probably some of you who may say you saw those over there. That could be correct. Just not something that I saw. I don't know everything, and I don't pretend to. But I never saw those. But I did see over there several of these converted kits. My one trip to Afghanistan, I was working in an armory, and I was out amongst troops, and I was just seeing what was out there. And I had saw one rifle, and this was an Air Force. It was a security police. He was carrying it around with him. And I looked at it, and it was a original Model 01 that was converted over. This is going to be one of the problems that would come across with these kits. These kits were, again, not OEM. They were made by somebody else. Those bolt carrier groups more than likely were made by not MCO or Capco, but by somebody else. These were all second, third, fourth, fifth part products. The problem we found with these was there was a significant issue with quality control and them conforming to the TDP, meaning the specs were off. The first thing that I saw, we were doing some repairs. We had some bolt carriers that we were pulling out of the wrapper and assembling and putting them in the rifles. I didn't recognize the cage code on these, and when I looked at them they came out of a high school machine shop, the way the machining was on them. But we went to install the bolts and put the cam pins in, and it wouldn't line up. You couldn't install the cam pin. The carrier did not line up properly the way the cam path was drilled. So we had like 5 or 6 of these carriers that were unserviceable. You couldn't even assemble them. So when I saw this kid's rifle over, this Air Force kid's rifle over there, I looked at it. I went to pull the bolt back, obviously, to check, make sure it was empty, pull the charging handle back, and it was, I mean, I literally had to yank on it. And I pulled it apart. The gas rings were scraping so hard that you had a hard time doing it manually. That showed that the stack of tolerances between that carrier and that bolt and those gas rings were brutally off. I would be shocked if that rifle would have cycled properly. I sure as hell wouldn't want to carry it. So when these conversion kits would come, the parts you didn't know what they were. And of course, with those older rifles, as you would do repair and you would send them over to like Anniston to have them updated, you're mixing and matching them with all these different parts coming from all these different companies. The one thing that we always did see, I never generally saw, at least over there anyways, I never saw any complete Colt or FN guns, and they were in there for repair. These were all ones that had parts replaced. OEM parts were relatively hard to come by. FN and Colt parts, you would always have these other companies. If you look, for the most part, a company like Colt or FN, all the parts that they're building are going into the guns they're producing and providing as full guns to the government. Of course, there's spare parts orders, but you're looking at Colt's capacity during the global war on terror. They were building parts to go into the rifles that they were shipping. That's why you had these other manufacturers who were building these components. But it did cause a problem using these second, third, and fourth source components. And when a lot of people would talk about the reliability problems of the M16 and M4 series, that was one of the first places you had to look, was what parts were they using. They were not OEM parts. And that was in these conversion kits, again, they were not OEM. They were subcontracted. Were they all bad? Absolutely not. I'm sure the parts were very good. I had shot Capco converted rifles. The ones I had shot had worked. The fit and finish were mil spec. They weren't great. They weren't poor. They were what they were. This was just a way to get through, and it was a way to get that fleet taken over as quickly as possible. So now let's fast forward now to times now. You are seeing M16A2s and M16A4s now being converted to M4A1s. And it's the same kind of a process. You're looking at M4A1 upper receivers, SOCOM barrels. You're looking at full auto fire control groups. You're looking at the telescopic receiver extension and stock assembly buffer spring. And you're looking at the same stamps that are going to go, they're going to take out, this time they're going to take out the burst, and they're going to go with auto on the left and right side for those stamps. And they're going to, instead of having just M4, they're going to have an A1 they're going to stamp on there, and they're converting those over. You would also see M4 carbines that were converted into M4A1s, where they would replace the upper receiver, they would replace some of the other minor components in there. Of course, you have to replace the buffer and whatnot, and now you would have converted M4s to M4A1s. The cost is certainly a lot cheaper with doing the conversion kits than to do completely new rifles. And quite frankly, an M4 upper receiver being converted into an A1 or an A4 being converted into an A1, there's no reason you can't do that. I mean, the receivers are all the same, just some different markings on them. So those programs still go on today with converting those rifles over. Over the last 10, 20 years, you've seen quite a few of those kits everywhere. You would see those barrels up there. You would see, again, the MCO and the barrels. Let's talk about one more thing, is about how we identify the components. Now, you can identify the upper receivers by the forging codes, and you can identify the barrels by the barrel codes of these parts being Capco or MCO. So, for instance, as you'll see from the photographs, Capco upper receiver, you're going to have a P instead of a C or an F. So again, P is spare parts, and that was one that was mostly used for Capco. Then, if you look at your MCO, it would have an E, and then the forging house. So, I believe the photograph you're going to see is EK. So it would be MCO with a Kaiser forged upper receiver. You would see, say, a PM would be Capco or spare parts upper receiver, Martin Marietta. That's how that would work. The barrels, on the other hand, the same. If you would look at a Colt or an FN or Colt barrel, CMP 556 Data 1/7, The Capco would be PMP 5.56 1/7. The MCO, it would be E 5.56 NATO 1/7. So that's how you identify them. Again, the barrels, or are they made specifically by MCO and Capco? I'm not sure. Those could be subcontracted out by MCO or Capco and then put together. Again, I'm not as familiar with that as a manufacturer because, again, that's a U.S. government company. It's not one that was ever into the commercial market. Bolt carriers, again, you would use the same bolt carriers and the same charging handles. Now, charging handles, again, you get the Model 601s. You could still find rifles, and you saw a photograph, and you'll see a photograph of one where you have a original Model 01 rifle. Again, the flat slab side receiver with the removable front pivot pin, the A2 upper receiver, and you'll see the triangular shaped charging handle. Again, you're reusing a lot of those components. So the bolt carriers, you can see anything from a Colt bolt, FN bolt, early chrome-plated bolt. You can see some of the U.S. government subcontracted bolts, some marked P, some marked N. You can find some various different marked bolts and carriers as well. Again, you've had several different subcontractors over all the years, and they all marked the bolts differently and the bolt carriers differently. So it could be literally any of a number of things. So those of you who are clone correct, I remember seeing several over the years. People will say, "Hey, I had one of these rifles and I want to do a clone correct one." So they would make lower receivers and they would do the Xing out of the auto and the burst and whatnot. So people want to get clone correct, they would get the Capco upper receivers and everything. Again, if that's what you carried, that's what you wanted to clone. That's what it was. But this was sort of the story that went behind these conversion kits, the A2s. And again, it was a very cost-effective way to upgrade that fleet and to do it a lot quicker. I can also tell you from my time at Colt, we did a lot of that too. We had foreign countries. One country in particular was Jordan. And I remember going to Jordan when I worked for Colt. We had probably sold them a couple hundred conversion kits. These are regular M4 government profile barrels to convert their rifles. Now, they had some foreign military aid original Vietnam era rifles. It looked like they saw the fall of Saigon. They had GM Hydromatic, they had Harrington and Richardson, they had Colts. They were mostly A1 type lower receivers, but we did see some 601s and we did see some XM16E1 receivers. So we went over there, we instructed them on how to do the conversions, again, taking those upper receivers. We provided them with the field gauges. Basically what it was a shim type gauge that you could stick between the upper receiver and the lower receiver to make sure that the pivot area was not out of spec, being that old. We also had hammer trigger pin roundness gauges to make sure that the hammer trigger pins were still within specification. And we went ahead and we removed the stock assemblies, installed the telescopic stock assemblies on them. We did replace the trigger components. Mostly it was because the springs on the disconnectors, rather than just bring springs and replace disconnector springs and disconnectors, we replaced the whole fire controller with newer updated parts. The upper receivers, again, did not come with bolt carrier groups. They came with, we used the existing bolt carrier groups and existing charging handles. We had assembled those, and then we had gone out to the range and did the shooting. I got some pictures here we'll show you that day, and some of those guns that we had converted over. And we shot, they shot. They had no problems, no malfunctions whatsoever. That was actually a very interesting day because the head of the range wanted to do a durability test. He wanted to fire 10 magazines just as fast, just changing the magazines as fast as he could. So he wanted to do a 300 round magazine dump. And again, this is a government profile barrel. This is where mil spec comes in. I knew, based off of my experience in watching some of these destruction tests, I knew that those guns would do that. I knew that those guns were going to be over 400 something rounds, 440 plus, before we were going to have any issues with those failing. So he went through and he did his 10 magazine dump without a single malfunction. He left the last round in there to see about the cook off, and of course it cooked off, but there was not a single malfunction. So I think we probably did 10 or 20 of those rifles, and then they were left to do the other conversions. And that was something that we had always offered those, because again, when you have those stocks of lower receivers, those lower receivers, they may look old, but they're just as good. They're still working. I think there's only a couple of the ones that we actually had to reject because they were just so damn worn. Lower receivers are just not really a high wearing component, unless you're taking the hammer trigger pins in and out, or you're taking pins in and out. They're just not really a high wear type of a system or type of a component. So this is just, again, this is a little bit more on some more historical data. For those of you who are into the retro, because as we know, retro is a big deal. M16A2s are now becoming more of a big deal for maybe those of us who that was our service rifle back in the early days of the Cold War. You're seeing companies like H&R coming out with A2s. You're seeing Springfield Armory's coming out with them. You're seeing you're seeing a couple other companies as well who are coming out with A2s, and they're back again. Cloning correctors are back. And they're still relevant. It's still a relevant gun. They're still used throughout the world. Again, it's just that was our last rifle where we used iron sights, but it's still a relevant rifle today. So I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, please click like, please subscribe, and even better, share. Thank you.